Russia has officially withdrawn from the grain initiative, right? So this is the commonly referred to as the grain deal, which allows Ukraine to export through the Black Sea. They're allowed to export grain to the rest of the world. As you guys know, both Russia and Ukraine are major suppliers of wheat and grain. And you know, there are a lot of reasons why Russia pulled out, which I'll get to in a second. But this is something that was one of the only diplomatic breakthroughs in this conflict so far. The only one, right? Where you had Turkey and the UN mediating and getting both Russia and Ukraine to sign this deal. It's actually multiple multiple agreements, because Russia and Ukraine never signed anything directly. It's more like Russia with the UN and then Ukraine with the UN and so on. I'll show you the agreements in a second, just so you get the idea. This allows Ukraine to export from these 3 ports in specific, right? So Odessa, Yuzhny, and Kornomorsk. And the Russian warships, essentially, they just give them safe passage, and this is coordinated out of Istanbul, out of Turkey. Obviously, there's inspections involved, right? You have people, and this is agreed to by all the parties, who get on the ships and inspect them to make sure there are no weapons on board, to make sure that they're actually carrying grain and nothing else, right? So why did the Russians pull out? Why would they pull out of it? Well, according to the EU and according to Blinken, and I'll show you all of their statements now, it's because Putin is evil. Putin just wakes up in the morning and he thinks, how can I starve people in Africa? That's all he does, right? This is, of course, before he goes and blows up people in Ukraine, because that's all he does. That's all he has on his mind. It's just murdering people, of course, right? Because Russians are evil and etc., right? So, I mean, it's farcical. It's really farcical. Look at this crap. This is a member of the European Parliament.
This is a narrative Putin always wants to get through, but we have to contest. It's clear that we have sanctions due to the war of aggression of Putin against Ukraine, but it is also clear that under this agreement, Putin was able to export also his own grains. But to lift now all the sanctions would not be possible because it would not help to stop the war. And at the end, the war is the problem. So Putin should stop the war and not now use hunger in the world as a weapon also against Ukraine and other countries.
We have sanctions on the Russians, yeah? She says the Russians were able to export grain. That's a complete lie. This is literally the reason why they pulled out, because they weren't allowed to do anything. They blocked the Russians from being able to export agricultural products. But of course, she can't tell you that, right? Because sanctions, yeah. Here, let me show you Blinken.
The result of Russia's action today, weaponizing food, using it as a tool, as a weapon in its war against Ukraine, will be to make food harder to come by in places that desperately need it and have prices rise. We're already seeing the market react to this as prices are going up. The bottom line is it's unconscionable. Should not happen. This should be restored as quickly as possible. And I hope that every country is watching this very closely. They will see that Russia is responsible for denying food to people who are desperately need it around the world, and to contribute to rising prices at a time when many countries continue to experience very difficult inflation.
Yeah, okay. Here, I'm going to torture you guys with these things because we have to go through this. Here's some guy from, what's his name, McCall, right? He's a member of Congress in the U.S.
Russia and Crimea. Russia has responded by saying they are going to put in a military blockade of Ukraine's grain exports, which essentially feeds a large portion of the world. What is your reaction to how Russia is responding?
I think it's very irresponsible. I think by blocking the Black Sea Grain Initiative that the World Food Program was able to negotiate with other nations, it will cause famine throughout many parts of northern Africa It will cause a food shortage in Europe, but also the United States. So you're going to see food prices going up, all over the world, globally. And it's very unfortunate that Putin has responded this way, but I'm not surprised. Ukraine is not gone as well as he thought it would have. And now you're seeing this retaliation from him that I think is going to put the world at risk. I know David Beasley, who negotiated last year.
So Putin wants to starve the world because and raise grain prices because the war in Ukraine is not going well. What?
Really appeal to Putin's, if he has any empathy, not to cause a global famine over this conflict. Unfortunately, Putin has decided to cause a global famine. A global famine.
It's coming. Everyone's going to starve to death because of Putin. So evil Russians. So let's get down to business. Why did the Russians pull out? The first reason is because they wanted the Russian Agricultural Bank to be connected to SWIFT. Okay, you remember SWIFT? It's the the first country that was ever kicked out of SWIFT was Iran. But Russia, they really went a step further. So it's basically an international messaging service that is used for payments, right? It's based in Belgium, and you've got most banks in the world connected to it. So the money doesn't go through it. It's just it communicates the changes in balance and so on. Okay, but it's crucial for doing business. And they refuse to make an exception for Russia's agricultural bank. So Russia is unable under this deal to sell its agricultural products because they have not made these exceptions. You know how they always lie? They say like, oh, these sanctions on Syria, they have a clause in there, an exception for humanitarian aid, right? And for NGOs. This is a complete lie. Yes, it's on paper, but in reality, right? When it comes to people's stomachs, when it comes to their standard of living, nothing. It plummets because it is so difficult to handle the bureaucracy and the red tape and to get an exception. And then after you've got an exception, from the United States, to then go and you have to convince banks, and you have to convince lenders and everybody, and traders to work with you, and insurance companies. You have to convince all of these parties to work with you, and most of them are just going to turn you down because it's too much of a headache for them. If they do something by accident, they do something wrong, then they get sanctioned. Their headquarters or offices are shut down in the United States. Their bank accounts are seized. It's a nightmare. So, this is how sanctions work, right? They basically turn you into a pariah. So when they say there's a clause, or an exception, it's a lie. It does not exist in reality. And this is exactly what's happening now with the Russians. So on paper, in the agreement, they were owed by Guterres, the United Nations Secretary General. He was supposed to go and make sure that they can really sell their, not just grain, but all agricultural products. That didn't happen, right? So when it comes to maritime insurance, that means when, this is another one of these sanctions packages where they said like, you remember, so this was in February and December, they put these bans on insurance companies from carrying Russian oil, because when you have ships and you're moving cargo, you need insurance, right? For a million different reasons, you have to get insurance, or you cannot operate. So that's how they targeted it, right? They put a price cap, which is ridiculous and didn't work. But they also told insurance companies, if you insure Russian ships, you'll get in trouble. We'll shut you down and take your money. So there are the restrictions on maritime insurance, okay? For the Russians, for them to ship, right? This is all to do with the Black Sea and beyond. Never happened. They never lifted these restrictions. They never made these exceptions, right? When it comes to getting spare parts, okay? This is another huge issue with sanctions, because whether you're trying to fix medical equipment to save people's lives, or you're trying to get spare parts for a plane, for a ship, whatever the hell it is, guess what? You can't. It's a nightmare in 50 million ways. Okay, so the United States and the EU and the West, they claim that they have made exceptions for Russia, but once again, this is not true. Okay. Also, fertilizer. The Russians are huge exporters of fertilizer, right? One of the most important top exporters of fertilizer in the world. Once again, they haven't lifted sanctions on fertilizer or people who sell fertilizer, people who are connected to that business. Nothing. So, you're still sanctioned. You're on an international sanctions list. You can't do business. And fertilizer is an agricultural product, is it not? There's also a pipeline. There's an ammonia pipeline that basically traverses Ukraine, and the Ukrainians blew it up. And excuse me, sorry. And they haven't allowed the Russians to export their ammonia through it for a long time now. Okay, so that was damaged, I think, back in June. Okay, so you have all of these four main issues that are still lingering, and no one has bothered to fix them. So they talk about, Russia's so evil. They want to, Putin is causing a global famine, but they don't tell you why the Russians pulled out of the deal. Have you heard these 4 points that I just outlined to you from any of these people who are just, talking about this grain deal as if they have any clue of what is going on? They never mention this, right? They always focus on what did the Russians do, right? Not, what made the Russians behave like this? It's always about Putin's action, not Putin's reaction, right? They always want to act like these things are happening in a vacuum, like they are completely isolated. Putin decided to cause a global famine. Not, there was a deal that was signed by the UN, by Turkey, by Russia, by Ukraine to facilitate the sale and export of Russian agricultural products as well. And this was not implemented. You failed to implement the deal. You went back on your word. That is your fault. Why should Russia abide by an agreement that you do not fulfill? When one party does not fulfill the contract, it's ripped up. It's the same thing with the nuclear deal, right? They say, the Iranians are raising they're replacing their centrifuges with newer ones, with better models. They're increasing the level of enriched uranium past 3.67%, which is the cap in the deal. They don't tell you why the Iranians are doing this. Like, Israel just blew up a nuclear plant in Iran, right? They don't care about those nuclear plants, of course. Or the United States left the deal. Right? The United States ripped it up, but you expect Iran to follow a contract that was ripped up by the United States? What does that even mean? This is lunacy. This is wild. It's same thing in Israel, right? Say, look, Hamas are firing rockets. Look at these terrorists. They're just randomly firing rockets because they hate Jews, right? They don't tell you, actually the Palestinians are living, under siege in Gaza, by Egypt, by Israel. They're living under occupation. They've had it up to here, 6-7 decades of this crap. They don't tell you that part. So this is the same thing here. They failed to fulfill this agreement. So Russia is pulling out. By the way, the Russians actually are not, this is funny. Look at the letter they sent. So this is where they announced, JCC Secretariat. You see here where it says 2. The JCC Secretariat is the body that was formed by this grain initiative and is based in Turkey, in Istanbul, and is charged with running this entire affair. So you'll have a representative from Russia, a diplomat from the Russian side, the Ukrainian side, Turkey, the UN, and so on. So they're addressing this, to the JCC, and they say the leadership of the Russian Federation has decided to terminate the implementation of the Black Sea Initiative, and it expires today on the 17th. So here they say terminate, but then when you go and you listen, for example, to Peskov, who's the Kremlin spokesperson, or you listen to the position in general of Russian diplomats and the government, they don't say that they're pulling out definitively. They say that for the moment, they won't renew the deal. Because you have to keep in mind, this deal was designed to expire every 4 months, pending renewal. Right, so every 4 months, everybody would have to sign and renew it. So the Russians did that multiple times, right? They don't tell you that part. So, despite the Russians being screwed out of this deal, they still renewed it for a whole year because it was created exactly a year ago. They don't tell you that part, huh? This is a pattern of provoking the Russians and then trying to make them look bad. Same thing in Ukraine. What is this whole war about? You have NATO encircling Russia decade after decade after decade, and then in Donbass, in eastern Ukraine, they're killing ethnic Russians, basically turning them into pariahs. And you remember that famous speech where Ukrainian politician was saying, we will have schools and they will have no schools, and their children have to hide in bomb shelters. I mean, Jesus Christ. These are your countrymen, supposedly. How the hell do you speak like that about them? It's just like sadistic, So you have this provocation in eastern Ukraine where you have a lot of ethnic Russians. They're not a majority in eastern Ukraine, but they are a large minority. And in Crimea, they are definitely a majority. And so you have the Ukrainian state, with the help of NATO, turning Eastern Ukrainians or ethnic Russians into pariahs, bullying them, shelling them, killing them. And then, of course, the NATO encirclement, which I mentioned. And then when Russia goes in on February 24th, 2022, they say, oh my God, look at what these goddamn Russians have done. Look at how evil they are. They just have nothing better to do than to go into Ukraine and murder, their neighbors and cousins. Just like that, for no reason, It's the same thing, look at Sudan. You have the Russians who are doing well there for themselves, they're big into the mining industry, gold. They're cool with Hemeti, right? Dagalo. They're cool with Burhan. No. Can't have that. Russians get permission from both of them to build a port in the Red Sea. Can't have that. Have to go into Sudan and stir trouble and turn it upside down. So there's no government being formed again, for another couple of years. And then the Russians can't build their base. And, they get screwed out of a little business and so on. You see the pattern that's going on here? It's very dishonest. It's extremely dishonest. You can't turn to these people for truth because they leave out key, factors, pillars of information just left out. So let me show you here. I'll show you Erdogan because he's the Turkey's president, obviously, and he helped mediate this. This is his reaction to Russia withdrawing temporarily.
In the month of August, we have preparations to host Mr. Putin in Turkey. The Black Sea Grain Corridor's extension, we agree on it. Guterres from the UN has sent a letter to Mr. Putin. So I hope that with that letter and with the joint efforts of us and Russia, the grain corridor efforts will be extended, and by doing so, the less developed or impoverished African countries' problems, as we will be continued, as we have agreed on together with Mr. Putin.
So he talks about impoverished African countries. Let me expand a little on that. You see, the World Food Program, which is run by the United Nations, a lot of their wheat comes from Ukraine, right? Remember, Russia and Ukraine, top exporters in the world of grains and wheat. So the World Food Program, a lot of their supplies go to Ethiopia and Yemen, right? Who caused that? Why? I wonder why. I wonder why people need assistance in Yemen. What could possibly have done this? Another great NATO adventure. And of course, Saudi Arabia. But in any case, they will suffer now because if Ukraine cannot get the wheat through, then by extension, not only do prices go up everywhere, but there's a shortage of food in these countries. So yes, this is obviously going to cause a lot of hardships, but who created this situation? It's not the Russians. The Russians signed the deal, but and they fulfilled their part. Did they block ships from leaving the 3 ports in Ukraine? Did they stop participating in the inspections? I think they did last month because after 11 months of being screwed, yeah. But they did their part. They held up their end of the deal. They did. But the others didn't. I want you to look at the agreement. Okay, so this is the memorandum of understanding that was signed between the United Nations and between Russia. Okay, it's one of the agreements that make up this initiative. It says here the Secretariat agrees, so that's the UN, right? Agrees to continue efforts to facilitate the transparent, unimpeded access of food and fertilizers, including the raw materials required to produce fertilizers, such as ammonia, originating from the Russian Federation to the world markets. This includes impediments that may arise in the sectors of finance, insurance, and logistics. What impediments are those? Sanctions, right? An impediment, an obstacle that impedes, that blocks, that prevents the Russians from actually being able to get their products on the world market. Sanctions. Refusing to connect the agricultural bank to SWIFT. These are facts. Right now, Russia's agricultural bank is still sanctioned and not connected to SWIFT. This is a fact. That is an impediment to this agreement. That means that the United Nations, and of course the people who are putting these sanctions in place, originally the United States, the EU, they are of course ultimately responsible. But the UN in this case, and Blinken, because Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, is saying this is a disaster, this is unfortunate. Then why don't you get the agricultural bank connected to SWIFT? You see, this is their fault. It's in their hands. And the agreement is black and white. It's crystal clear what the obligations are in regards to the other parties. Crystal clear. The Secretariat will endeavor to engage relevant authorities, that means the people placing the sanctions, and the private sector to effectively exempt food and fertilizers, including raw materials such as ammonia, originating from Russia, and based on the principle that those measures do not apply to food and fertilizers. Right? It's very clear. This is the official agreement. It's clear as day. One other aspect that you guys need to be aware of. What the EU did is they allowed Ukraine to flood European markets with their grain. And they even did it on a tax-exempt basis. Okay, so basically no sales tax whatsoever, or import tax, and Ukraine could get its grain on the market. And this was, of course, very bad for neighboring countries. I mean, you can see it's so tiny. You can barely make it out. If you look at the bottom, there's purple, and then there's also turquoise. So you can see in the years 2020 and 2021, there's basically nothing. There's no Ukrainian grain coming in compared to 2022. These years are dwarfed by how much grain was coming in from Ukraine. So I think that really puts into perspective how much Ukrainian grain was making its way into European markets. Now, this is bad for two reasons. Reason number one is that I thought this is supposed to go to Yemen and Ethiopia and the countries that are really at risk of starvation. No? They keep talking about how sorry they feel for them. Why the hell are you busy flooding Europe with Ukrainian grain? The second reason why this is bad is because local farmers completely screwed. And they even banned Ukrainian grain in some countries like Hungary. They banned it outright, and the EU didn't like that, and so on. And then, when it's too late, after it's already too late, you can see this is from 3rd of May this year. The EU, they give 100 million to support farmers in Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Slovakia because they got screwed from the EU's brilliant plan to flood Europe with Ukrainian grain. Yeah, but 100 million is nothing compared to what they lost. It's a joke. It's a joke compared to what the farmers lost. Here's Guterres. Okay, here's the UN Secretary General.
I'm deeply disappointed that my proposals went unheeded. Today's decision by the Russian Federation will strike a blow to people in need everywhere. But it will not stop our efforts to facilitate the unimpeded access to global markets for food products and fertilizers from both Ukraine and the Russian Federation. I particularly want to recognize the efforts of the government of Turkey in this regard. Looking ahead, our goal must continue to be advancing global food security and global food price stability. These will remain the focus of my efforts, taking into account the rise in human suffering that will inevitably result from today's decision. We will stay fixed on finding pathways for solutions. There is simply too much at stake in a hungry and hurting world, and I thank you.
You know, again, I love the UN. They do great work, but his words, they're hollow. They ring hollow. You know, I'm not trying to, talk badly about the man, but where were these words when Russia was complaining for an entire year? Hey, you guys are not implementing the deal. Remember, the agreement puts the responsibility of getting these sanctions for the agricultural sector lifted on him in particular. It's his job to do that. If Russia has withdrawn from the deal, it's because you didn't do a good enough job in convincing and getting the rest of the world to exempt the Russian agricultural sector. You cannot blame the Russians for ripping up a contract that the other party does not respect. I mean, this is basic, it's just common sense. Here's Putin. Look what he had to say.
Искренне стремятся к выполнению, в том числе и в отношении России, соответствующих условий. Вот и в этом у меня нет сомнений. Но у них ничего не получается, потому что западные страны не собираются исполнять данных обещаний. Но как одна из опций, не сначала продление, а потом выполнение обещаний, а сначала выполнение обещаний, а потом наше участие. Что я имею в виду? Мы можем приостановить наше участие в этой сделке. И если все в очередной раз говорят, что все данные нам обещания будут исполнены, ну пусть исполнят это обещание. И мы сразу же присоединимся к этой сделке. Искренне.
Right, so you understand what Putin is saying here. He's saying we're ready to get back into the deal. I know the letter which I showed to you from the Russians to the JCC says they have terminated their participation. What they meant is they have suspended it temporarily, pending what? The fulfillment of the other party's obligations. That's what he's saying here very clearly. He says Russia's ready to get back into the deal as soon as the other side hold up their end of the agreement and respect their own words and commitments. I think that's fair. It's just common sense, right? There's nothing bad about that. He's not saying, we're going to destroy any Ukrainian ship that dares to give, to send grain to starving people in whatever country. No, he's saying we want this agreement, but we want it in full, the whole agreement, not just one side, a one-sided thing. I think this is the most common sense and mature stances you could possibly have. It's the same thing with the Iranians. The Iranians never pulled out of the nuclear deal. They're still in it to this day. As a matter of fact, a whole year after Trump ripped up the nuclear deal, the Iranians were abiding by the agreement to the T, to the letter. Okay, everything. And even now, when they have 60% enriched uranium or more, they did it incrementally, gradually. They did 20 every time someone tried to screw them. Israel blowing up a nuclear plant, the United States putting more sanctions or leaving it. They said they increased it bit by bit. Guess what? They can do that in the agreement. It says so. Iran is free of any obligations once the United States pulls out and puts on sanctions, and that's exactly what Trump did. So, you can see very clearly one side is being mature, one side is putting things into perspective and really wants things to work, right? When Russia signs an agreement, it respects that agreement. Look at Minsk 1 and 2. You have François Hollande, the former French president, and Angela Merkel, the former German chancellor, laughing now, mocking the Russians and making fun of them because they admit that they wasted the Russians' time, that they had never had any intention to follow through on the Minsk agreement. They said it was just a ruse, it was a ploy to buy more time for Ukraine, to arm Ukraine. I mean, these are not my words, they're Angela Merkel's words and François Hollande's words. They admit this openly. So you see the difference is that when the Russians sign something, they fulfill the agreement. The other side doesn't. In this case, right? If we're talking about Minsk. Same thing with the grain deal. The other side doesn't fulfill it. Iran signs something, they fulfill it. They actually, their word carries weight. When they sign something, they respect it. And unfortunately, any hunger or famine that occurs as a result of Russia's withdrawal, you have no one else to blame but the other parties that refuse to allow Russia to export its grain and its agricultural products and its fertilizer and ammonia and so on. I mean, this is ridiculous. Why should the Russians allow Ukraine to make money? Although, again, if we look at if you look at this more in detail, I don't think they made too much money. But, the point here is that just out of principle, why should the Russians allow Ukraine to unimpeded passage when they are at war with Ukraine, right? Perhaps not officially, but certainly in actuality. And then, allow themselves to be screwed out of the same opportunities. I mean, this makes no sense whatsoever. Why would you do that? Especially when you have a deal that protects you and affords you, the right to sell your agricultural product. I'm sorry, but this issue is very easy to grasp. But of course, on the media, they're not going to tell you the truth. They just tell you, oh, look at Russia's reaction. Oh, look at Iran's. No, not reaction. That's the whole part of the problem. They say action. They act like it just happened for no reason. Right? Same thing with Hamas. Same thing with Iran. It's always look at their action. Not, oh, we screwed them and that's a reaction to our behavior.